So thank you very much for coming. Nice to see you all, some familiar faces. So this is our abstract that we submitted, just to remind you a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So in essence, kind of just to sort of cover those points, we're going to briefly explore the sort of broader context of where these treatments are in relation to them getting regulatory approval, the trials and tribulations of medicalization. And I think in order to explore some of the relational and contextual complexities of this work, we sort of want to ground a little bit into the sort of basics. So thinking about things like set and setting, what the actual practice and fundamentals of the work is. But moving on from that, we want to think about, I suppose, the particular opportunities and challenges of this work that it presents, what's unique and even hopeful about it, but also what might be, need more thought and even at times some careful caution. We want to speak a little bit about our research into the importance of the therapeutic alliance for outcomes and how powerfully stirred attachment dynamics can be in this work. And finally, we'll look at how the institutional cultures and health economic considerations influence the therapeutic relationships' capacity to contain and integrate these kind of quite powerful experiences and the psychic material that emerges. So I'll start over. Jonny's going to begin. I'll hand over to him.
So the results from the Imperial depression trial we were involved in were encouraging, but the headline news in terms of the treatment pipeline is that last November results of a larger trial for treatment-resistant depression were published, and outcomes support a bigger trial, and if successful, this treatment could be licensed around 2025. Many people's favourite corporadelic bad guy, Compass Pathways, in conjunction with the Bethlehem Hospital and Institute of Psychiatry in South London, have made a purpose-built research clinic for trials like the one mentioned above. I think it's important to hold in mind how the regulatory process, research infrastructure, and various stakeholders, especially commercial ones, interact to contain, but inevitably also constrain and limit the psychotherapeutic process, outcomes, and how we interpret them. To answer the question of how the treatment is delivered, it's important to emphasize how the extra pharmacological factors are crucial in determining the particular quality of participants' psychedelic experience, and various studies point to the nature of the experience being a key determinant of treatment outcomes. In other words, therapeutic outcomes are not a simple product of isolated pharmacological action, but rather are experience dependent. To take this further, some participants in the Imperial depression trial had peak or mystical experiences in the placebo or low-dose psilocybin arm. Some of these participants felt a little sheepish on finding out which arm they were in, but for me, the combined power of expectation, intention, ritual, music, and personality traits like absorption and suggestibility cannot be underestimated. For those interested, there's a paper called Tripping on Nothing, where psychiatrists and anthropologists at McGill experimentally reproduce this phenomenon. When thinking about the extra pharmacological factors, it's helpful to lean on the archetypal psychedelic tricksters' concepts of set and setting. In terms of set, the starting point in the depression trial was recruitment. We were looking for participants with whom we felt we could rapidly establish a good rapport or therapeutic alliance, a capacity to trust in their therapists, themselves, the substance, and the therapeutic process were foregrounded as important aspects to nurture throughout the preparation process. This really started from first point of contact with the team. Already, we were exploring their attachment histories with a view to nurturing the best therapeutic alliance that we know is a key driver to outcomes in all psychotherapies. Alongside this, we were looking for participants to approach the treatment process with a spirit of openness, a personality construct linked to suggestibility that has a more contentious ethical history within psychology. It's important to hold in mind this level of thought and care given to recruiting the right participant. Dramatic effect sizes are relevant to tightly selected patient cohorts falling within a diagnostic category with enormous heterogeneity. More adverse events will emerge if and when the treatment is licensed and given for patients for whom this kind of therapy is not suitable, especially when drives to cut costs reduce the psychotherapeutic support. In terms of setting, I think many people will be familiar with images like this of our student bedsit interior design efforts, camouflaging the institution. I'm delighted to hear purpose-built clinics can, of course, move this forwards. The importance of music cannot be overstated. I mentioned a paper here written from an earlier pilot study that captures the primacy of the musical experience. It found that the nature of people's musical experience significantly predicted reduction in depressive symptoms a week after psilocybin, in contrast to the experience of drug intensity. We encourage the use of eye shades to facilitate engagement with their internal intrapsychic world versus the potential for a more superficially distracting experience of perceptual distortion in the room. In the prep session, we'd review their mental state, continue discussions around early parts of their life that they feel could be connected to their current difficulties, and more generally look to deepen trust. We'd provide an opportunity to air shameful, difficult, frightening aspects of history or self-experience, and offer tips, explanations of how things can go in sessions. We explore the possibility of challenging experiences and how these can be beneficial, if leading to insight or catharsis, and would run through a visualization exercise, an exercise in surrendering to a more embodied experience to disturb ruminative loops, and finally, look at intentions, a long-standing staple of psychedelic therapy. So what does therapists actually do in the room? Leo Zeff, a psychologist who worked in the underground, wrote, "When it worked, the therapist was just a bystander." This is often true, and the treatment's arguably all the more powerful when patients feel a greater sense of creative agency over their experience. However, the statement doesn't capture how crucial it is the quality of presence guides bring to the session. Ideally, we offered an unspoken containment that allowed participants to let go and yet feel held at a deeper level, in keeping with the psychoanalyst Daniel Stern's concept of the framing environment. Such a concept is helpful if we remember to what degree the experience could be viewed as a regression, both in terms of the brain state and the psychodynamic situation of what's often a parental therapist couple tending to someone vulnerable in need of care and support. The therapeutic use of touch was used, generally taking hold of their hand, but sparingly and with discussion, practice, and consent. It is and will remain a contentious area within psychedelic-assisted therapies, where the very essence of the psychedelic experience could be described as one of shifting boundaries between different perceptions, the experience of time, and self and other. Integration happened the following morning. We worked with a model called Accept, Connect, and Embody, developed by Dr. Oz Watts, the clinical lead, that emphasizes psychological flexibility. This emphasis marries well with both neuroscience of the psychedelic brain and anthropological literature on general mechanisms of therapeutic action across different modalities that proposes many forms of healing, including psychotherapy, work by inducing psychological states marked by flexibility or an enhanced ability to shift cognitive sets. We adopted an open, flexible, and humanistic approach over something more structured and directive. And we used a funnel analogy to capture how we would try to distill what's often experienced initially as chaotic and beyond language. Of course, in many cases, this metaphor is ill-suited to a more complex and messy process. In hindsight, I feel opportunities were missed in this trial with more relational and transference-based thinking, not so much as excluded, but certainly taking more of a back seat within this emerging therapeutic model.
So during this trial, we were both working as psychiatrists and as therapists. And so we were doing things like screening patients, but also being in the room, doing integration therapy. And what that allowed us was to really follow most of the patients from start to finish, directly or indirectly. And one of the things that we noticed that, people's experiences were as variable as, for example, dreams are. They can be very somatic or in the body, deeply emotional, full of interesting visuals. In a way, it can often look like what one experiences in a year of therapy just in a few hours. People journeying through their life experiences, old traumas, processing difficult and painful feelings. It wasn't unusual to see people lying in the bed, deeply sobbing, grieving, and mourning for things that they've lost, for others, or for what they've experienced. So, one of the proposed mechanisms of psychedelics is that they weaken ego boundaries, lower psychological defenses, and allow access to the unconscious mind. And that taking psychedelics allows people access to parts of themselves they normally can't or don't feel safe to, which is in lines with ideas in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that therapy is a process of making the unconscious conscious. And these ideas link to our neuroscientific understanding of psychedelics, this idea of new connections, entropy, less rigidity and constraint. But allowing unconscious material to emerge can be challenging. These are feelings, memories, traumas, parts of themselves that people have put away into boxes for very good reason, perhaps even a survival mechanism in difficult circumstances. But there's something about psychedelics that seems to be able to catalyze and support this process in a way that is quite unique and can feel at times quite remarkable. But what I'm describing here is a sort of quintessential or even ideal psychedelic experience that you might hear about in a podcast or read about in an article, which of course is not always the case. It's important that we keep in mind that actually lowering these defenses or putting people in contact with these difficult parts of themselves might not always be safe and might not be helpful. I remind you of how Jonny spoke about how carefully the participants were screened coming into our trial. And one thing that we got really interested in was, watching all these participants go on their journeys and seeing, some patients go down this sort of pathway that, you read about in articles or in podcasts. And then also wondering, well, what's happening with the other people, those who had a rockier or much more difficult journey, who left the trial, still depressed, sometimes angry, disappointed, and connected to that, lots of questions about the mechanisms of change in psychedelic therapy, who responds and why or how. And as many of you will be aware, researchers have started to think about two main important flavors of psychedelic experience, if you will. One is the idea of the mystical experience, a sense of unity, ineffability, sacredness, transcendence, deep connection, and also emotional breakthrough. Experiencing emotional release or catharsis after facing and overcoming difficult or previously inaccessible emotions or memories, gaining personal and interpersonal insights, which is, of course, much more linked to the kinds of ideas we would think about in traditional talking therapies. And what a lot of research has shown is that the intensity of the mystical experience or the emotional breakthrough is linked to greater clinical improvement. So the more that you experience in the day, the more change you see afterwards. And one thing that we really started to think about was what seemed to be a bit of a differentiating factor between those who how people did, I guess, in the trial, was something around what the therapeutic relationship felt like, if the participants seemed to trust us, if it felt safe between us, which makes sense. The strength of the therapeutic alliance has been shown across the majority of psychotherapies, CBT, psychoanalysis, whatever you're doing, it nearly is always the most important factor. So why not in psychedelic assisted therapy? And as Jonny has already mentioned, the importance of the therapeutic relationship and the idea of trust has always been intuitively held as integrally important in this work across most settings and cultural contexts. But despite its accepted importance, there really has not been that much research into it. And as interest in psychedelics grows, there will also be a financial pressure to cut down on costs as much as possible, including that of the therapeutic support, meaning research like this might really matter. So based on this idea, we decided to investigate the role of the therapeutic relationship in the experiences of participants in our trial. And our hypothesis was that a strong relationship would predict bigger experiences, higher scores on mystical experience, emotional breakthrough, and that ultimately this would predict greater changes in depression scores, i.e. people would feel better on exits. And the results confirmed our hypothesis. The strength of the therapeutic reliance of Rapport predicted the strength of the mystical experience and emotional breakthrough on the day, which ultimately predicted final changes in depression scores. So in essence, really supporting this idea that people need to feel safe and contained in the therapeutic relationship in order to open up to the vulnerabilities of a psychedelic experience, to allow that unconscious material to emerge, which will create meaningful change for them. So it's important to keep in mind that, of course, as in all psychotherapies, there's probably a lot of parallel streams of relational healing at play. There's the way that therapeutic relationship supports people to really be able to go into the experience. At a more explicit verbal level, it might include things like narrative building, gaining understanding of our relational patterns, and perhaps their early origins. But there's also something about the experience of being in an intensely vulnerable or regret state, receiving care and support that might provide a more experiential or even embodied healing experience. The next obvious question to ask, of course, is what might determine therapeutic alliance? So first, there are things like therapist factors, our own kind of interpersonal disposition, having done our own therapy or other kinds of healing work, supervision, training. There's also the patient factors, so their attachment style or their internal object relations. What's their relational history and trauma? And practically, what this indicates is that for people who might find it a bit more difficult to build that trust or safety, we might need to support them in a different way than many of the trials are at the moment. For example, a much longer preparation period prior to dosing, allowing additional time to build trust. Meaning this kind of evidence might help us to think about where someone might need to be therapeutically, or even you could say relationally, to really avail of a psychedelic session, which might become particularly relevant if this treatment becomes quite expensive. We'll need to think kind of very carefully, where in a therapeutic process does someone need to be for it to be the right time to introduce a psychedelic? Where might a patient or even the therapeutic relationship need to be? But here's where we start thinking a little bit more about the nuances and complexities of this work, because of course, this is all built around the narrative of positive relationships, big psychedelic experiences, being sort of depression-free at the end of sort of 6 to 9 weeks, as is typical in Imperial, as being a sort of optimal healing path. But many of us will know that actually sometimes healing looks like working with very deep feelings of mistrust or lack of safety in a relationship with your therapist, or to put it in more technical terms, working with the negative transference. Or that a healing journey means getting in contact with fear or pain, maybe even looking more depressed than when you started, breaking down in order to break through. But this kind of work doesn't really fit neatly into short-term trials with short-term measures, looking for rapid changes in symptoms, which realistically map neatly onto the mechanisms of medications like antidepressants, but not really any therapeutic process. There's also the question of what might happen in the room that really doesn't fit into most of our measures. I could say from what we've seen in our times as guides that these experiences can include sort of intensely challenging experiences in which people get quite stuck, something unprocessed, not worked through in their difficulties. I remember one participant who had a gentle, quite beautiful experience to start, something quite majestic, even a bit idealized, you could say. His next experience he described as a stuck, drudging hell. He had a really long history of complex trauma, self-medicating with every kind of substance you can think of. And you can see in a way how his psychedelic experience was mirrored by this. All the pain he had kept out with these substances came rushing in during his second session after that initial high. And that man left the study far more depressed than when he came in. So although I think psychedelic work can include challenges and stuckness and opening up to pain, we do need to consider the safety and ethics of that when what we're offering is only very short-term support. On the other hand, it can often look like a patient who says, they're not feeling much, it's not working for me. And unfortunately, these kinds of experiences are often mistakenly labeled as sort of resistance or non-response. But if one looks closer and zooms in the detail, there's always something happening in the room to be worked with. There could be an amplification of something else, a psychological defense or a relational difficulty. We had 2 patients who insisted they were on the placebo arm of our trial, so people who had been given a very, very low dose of psychedelic and antidepressant. They hadn't been given psychedelics. But what was in the room were very strong feelings of being let down, of being uncared for, of not being chosen, of being neglected, all things which can be worked with. And when we were able to, the second time, having had the first experience, we were a little bit more wise, we were able to work with these feelings in a slightly different way. And that participant did manage to have an experience in her second session, actually watching herself die as a child, deeply mourning for herself. She was somebody who'd had 2 very challenging siblings, 2 overwhelmed parents, who had sort of stuffed her needs and wants kind of from a very early age, stopped expecting or asking for care. You might get a patient who just keeps laughing, gets very paranoid, says, I have to leave. One time I was co-guiding with one of my therapists, and we found ourselves sort of falling into various roles, moving between becoming very sort of intrusively anxious, a bit detached or avoidant, we found ourselves quite split, and what we were supposed to do was a very challenging case. But when we were able to kind of really talk things through together and work and think about, okay, what we both experienced in the room as a kind of parental couple, we realized that in lots of ways what we were doing was really a reflection of her parents. And so once we were able to kind of work that through and process it together, we were able to come together more cohesively and have quite a different second experience in the room. So keeping in mind the complexity of this work, it's clear to me in the future that we need to have a lot more flexibility with potentially longer term pieces of work, which clinical trials tend not to offer. But then, of course, comes in questions around cost effectiveness. At the moment, our trials are set up for what could be described as short cases. And I think there's a real appetite in mental health services for short-term treatments. Treatments like CBT is rapidly overtaking more long-term intensive therapies like psychoanalysis. And there's a risk that psychedelics will be seen as a sort of magic wand that will rapidly remove very long-standing difficulties. And the truth is, although we've seen clinical improvements working in trials that mean there really is a lot to feel very excited and hopeful about here, there's so much hype and media coverage around psychedelics that we feel it's really important to stay grounded, realistic, and even cautious. Psychedelic therapy evokes quite strong reactions in the room, but also collectively and societally. And there's a bit of a split between sort of a denigration, a lot of fear and anxiety, and an idealization of researchers, gurus, questionable figures labeling themselves as shamans, and the treatment itself. But I'll hand back over to Jonny, who's going to talk a little bit more about this wider picture.
Is this something you want to talk about here? The second? We've definitely miscommunicated. I was hoping you were going to talk about this bit. I'm going to skip through to my bit because we're quite short on time. We should have spoken about that, shouldn't we? Yeah, I'd now like to widen the lens a little further, both beyond and to include our biomedical gaze. The sociologist Ida Hartogson describes psychedelics as a psychopharmacological chameleon in his book American Trip. What I think he means by this is that pharmacologically, they render users exquisitely sensitive to their environment or context. This can be their immediate physical and interpersonal environment, their own internal world, but also the broader social unconscious. So the psychedelic experience hasn't just come to shape culture, but culture shapes the psychedelic experience. A bit like having Freudian dreams if you go to a Freudian analyst, and Jungian dreams if you go to see a Jungian analyst, as Timmy mentioned, commentators have remarked on the greater likelihood of mystical type experiences in Johns Hopkins trials in the US versus more emotionally cathartic ones at Imperial as a product of the differing institutional cultures and intellectual or spiritual proclivities of their researchers. Similarly, the commercial imperative to develop psychotherapeutic treatment protocols that are scalable to reduce costs will come to shape the variety and nature of psychedelic experiences that health systems can contain and work with. Should more psychodynamically or relationally informed work be marginalized, this will, in my view, likely increase the risk of adverse events. An amalgam of different cases that springs to mind was where a participant locked themselves in the toilet for nearly an hour during a high-dose session. They were confused and frightened. Through understanding their attachment history, we were able to see how it was possible that a powerful negative paternal transference was emerging against myself in the context of the participant's cold and emotionally unavailable father, and against my co-therapist, who came to represent a much longed-for maternal figure who nevertheless could never meet nor contain the participant's emotional needs as a child. Growing up, this participant often retreated to the toilet in the family home to literally find their own mind. The participant quite explicitly confirmed our hunch of how we were being experienced, and being able to think together with the participant about this felt crucial to transforming what might easily have spiraled into a more harmful and destructive experience into one of greater understanding, self-compassion, and growth. We know that man's used psychedelics for millennia. They're of social, sacramental, and or therapeutic value when used in conjunction with a cultural container that's evolved to suit their use. I feel this perspective necessarily problematizes the question of therapeutic potential, the Western biomedical paradigm prioritizes the production of particular types of knowledge, of which the double-blind RCT is one we're especially enchanted by. Whilst there's the colourful history of the prohibition of research following psychedelics leaking out of the laboratory container and lubricating the counterculture, a more prosaic one has its origin with a thalidomide scandal that ushered in the Kefauver-Harris amendments in the US. This was legislation designed to safeguard against such tragedies by foregrounding the methodological rigour of the double-blind RCT. The historian Matthew Oram points to how funding for psychedelic research dried out, not just from the substances falling foul of the war on drugs, but because researchers struggled to meet the exacting demands of a research methodology poorly suited to this kind of therapy. Today, blinding remains nigh on impossible. Active placebos simply don't cut the mustard. There are significant cultural looping effects around the hype, driving high expectancy, and conversely, nocebo in those in control arms, thereby inflating effect sizes. Anthropologist Daniel Gifford, in her book Acid Revival, The Psychedelic Renaissance and the Quest for Medical Legitimacy, is especially good on drawing attention to how the ghost of Timothy Leary continues to haunt the way the science is performed by researchers who are preoccupied with how it's perceived by mainstream audiences. I wonder if this self-consciousness might explain some of our fetishization of the double-blind RCT that's ill-suited to the task of establishing efficacy with psychotherapies. Much like many psychoanalytic writers refer to Freud as a form of rhetoric to reassure readers and themselves of their allegiance to the boundaries of their guild, we must invoke the cult of evidence-based medicine. Debts are paid and gravitas accrued. Greater awareness of this performative aspect of the science, contingent on cultural and political histories, would, I hope, engender some epistemic humility at our findings and keep the door open to a plurality of perspectives on whether and how psychedelics might work, whatever we mean by this. I'm glad to say there is growing discussion around the limitations of the double-blind RCT for exploring psychedelic-assisted therapies. Timmy Davis has astutely pointed out how, in the act of honouring indigenous use of plant medicines, as of course we should, psychedelic medical discourse projects out all the messy but powerful contextual factors that goes on in psychedelic therapy. Expectancy, ritual, and suggestibility, for example. These are all unwelcome guests in a clinical trial research paradigm so fond of isolating drug effects from the context within which it's given. And researchers at King's are asking how meaningful it is to tease apart the synergy between psychotherapeutic mechanisms, drug effects, and common factors like expectancy and therapeutic alliance. Got quite a dry mouth now from speaking fast. I've got one final slide. It's a quote from a letter, thank you, that Dr. Eduardo Schenberg wrote to a medical journal entitled, "With Sneaky Subversion, Who is Blind in Psychedelic Research?"